She rode into the forest as a queen. She left as scattered flesh among the roots. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1213, the serene canopy of the pilous forest in Hungary hid a secret darker than death. Beneath trees dressed in royal reds and golds, a hunting party moved gracefully at its center, a proud woman in fine garments embroidered with gold thread. Her name was Gertrude of Merania, Queen Consort of Hungary, elegant, composed, and powerful. She believed she ruled not just the court, but the fate of a kingdom. But what she didn't see, what no royal senses could detect, were the eyes in the trees. Watching, waiting, hating. Within moments, those eyes would become swords, and those swords would become her undoing. What happened next was so brutal, so symbolic, that it would echo across centuries and scar the cultural memory of a nation. According to legend, the queen's body was not only murdered, it was desecrated. Her limbs severed, her remains left in a clearing where wild pigs, considered unclean and damned in medieval Christian belief, were said to have devoured her. Whether that part is true or not, we may never know. But this wasn't just an assassination. This was a message and execution scripted as political theater, a ritual humiliation, a violent rejection of everything she symbolized: foreign blood, female authority, and unapologetic power. Gertrude was not an innocent victim, nor a pure villain. She was something far more dangerous in the 13th century, a woman who ruled like a man, who favored her own people over the native elite, who refused to apologize for her ambition. And for that, they didn't just kill her. They annihilated her body, erased her dignity, tried to devour her legacy. But why? What made this woman so hated, so feared, that nobles risked their lives to butcher her like prey? And what did her death unleash not just in her kingdom, but in the collective soul of Hungary itself? To answer that, we have to go back into the politics, betrayals, bloodlines, and broken loyalties that led to that moment in the woods. Because buried beneath the soil of the pilous forest is not just a corpse, it's a warning. And 800 years later, we're still listening. Before she became the most hated woman in Hungary, Gertrude of Merania was royalty twice over by birth and by marriage. She wasn't just a noble bride. She was the product of a dynasty that played chess with Europe's power structures, born around 1185 to Berthold IV of Andechs, a powerful Bavarian count elevated to Duke of Merania by the Holy Roman Emperor. Gertrude entered the world already wrapped in ambition. Her bloodline was impeccable, her family vast and strategic. Her sister Agnes became Queen of France, and another, Hedwig, would later be canonized as Saint Hedwig of Silesia. Gertrude was not raised to be silent, obedient, or decorative. She was raised to be useful, marriageable, and politically dangerous. So when she was offered to Andrew of Hungary, the youngest son of the late King Bela III, it wasn't a love match, it was a geopolitical alliance in silk and gold. The marriage took place before 1203 and bound Hungary to the interests of the German throne. But alliances like these never come cheap. The match dragged Andrew into the brutal power struggle for the German crown, pitting him against his own brother, King Emmerich of Hungary, who backed the rival claimant. Family loyalty meant nothing when crowns were on the table. Andrew rebelled. He failed. He was imprisoned. And Gertrude, newlywed, foreign, and vulnerable, was forced to flee to her father's court, a queen without a kingdom. But fate moves fast when kingdoms are unstable. In 1204, King Emmerich died, leaving only a young son as heir. 1 year later, the child king died under suspicious circumstances. Just like that, the path was cleared. Andrew ascended the throne. Gertrude returned in triumph. and Hungary got a queen whose loyalty lay not with its soil, but with the empire that raised her. This was the moment the fault lines began to form. To the Hungarian elite, Gertrude was not a unifier. She was a foreign queen with a German agenda, the smiling face of an expanding empire. What began as a royal marriage soon became a political infection, and while the wedding had united kingdoms on parchment, it had planted the seeds of one of the bloodiest betrayals in medieval Europe. Because Gertrude didn't just marry into Hungary, she married into its fears. And those fears would fester until they exploded, sword in hand, deep in the forest. Power doesn't just reveal character, it exposes who society is willing to forgive for having it. And Gertrude of Merania was never meant to be forgiven. When her husband, King Andrew II, ascended the Hungarian throne, Gertrude stepped into more than the role of queen consort, she stepped into a political vacuum. Andrew was frequently away on military campaigns, chasing foreign ambitions and leaving the kingdom exposed. In his absence, Gertrude ruled, not in name, not as a figurehead, but in action, decision, and decree. And that terrified the men around her. A 13th century chronicler sneered that she conducted the affairs of the kingdom like a man. But that was no compliment. It was an accusation. In the rigid gender order of medieval Hungary, a queen who governed was seen not as capable but as unnatural, even dangerous. She wasn't stepping beyond her station, she was erasing the line entirely. Worse yet, she brought her German entourage with her. Her court filled with foreign advisors, her household with Bavarian retainers, her trust placed in men whose names the Hungarian nobility couldn't pronounce, let alone tolerate. Her greatest political misstep wasn't just ambition, it was favoritism. She lavished titles, lands, and royal privileges upon her German relatives, pushing aside the native magnates who saw these rewards as their birthright. Her brother Berthold was appointed Archbishop of Kalocsa, one of the highest ecclesiastical offices in Hungary. Later, he was made voivode of Transylvania, effectively governor of the entire region, a staggering amount of authority granted to a foreigner. To the Hungarian nobles, this wasn't just nepotism, it was theft. Some chroniclers claimed she gave away a third of Hungary to her German allies. That figure is likely exaggerated, but the outrage it stoked was very real. Gertrude wasn't just governing, she was rewriting the power map, redrawing the lines of privilege, and doing it all with a regal smile. But every title she granted, every estate she handed out, chipped away at the patience of those who still believed Hungary belonged to Hungarians. And with every decision, the queen carved her own name deeper into a death warrant already being whispered behind castle doors. Because in the medieval world, a foreign woman with power was not just a queen, she was a threat. And threats, as the nobles would soon remind her, get eliminated. In the chessboard of medieval politics, favoritism wasn't just unwise, it was fatal. And Gertrude of Merania didn't just play favorites, she played them across borders. What began as quiet murmurs of dissatisfaction among Hungary's native nobility quickly escalated into a storm of outrage as the Queen's court filled with German names, German accents, German ambitions, land grants, court appointments, even religious posts one by one. The Queen handed them to her Bavarian kin like royal favors at a family wedding. But to the Hungarian elite, it felt more like a slow-motion invasion. Her brother Berthold, a figure of endless controversy, wasn't merely elevated, he was catapulted into unprecedented power. First named Archbishop of Kalocsa, then Voivode of Transylvania, he wielded influence that would have traditionally belonged to Hungarian-born lords. To many, this was more than nepotism. It was a betrayal, a deliberate act of cultural disloyalty that threatened the very soul of the kingdom. The resentment wasn't just political, it was ethnic, deep, ancient. Gertrude may have worn a Hungarian crown, but in the eyes of the nobles, Her heart still beat for the empire across the border. Some chroniclers, likely inflamed by anger and bias, claimed she had given away a third of Hungary's lands to foreigners. That figure might have been hyperbolic, but the emotions it captured were not. Gertrude had become a symbol of everything the Hungarian aristocracy feared: foreign influence, foreign power, foreign control. And more than that, she was a woman leading this cultural transformation, one who dared to rule not just beside her husband, but in his place. In medieval Europe, a foreign queen with power was already a threat, but a foreign queen who showed open allegiance to outsiders, that was unforgivable. The court turned cold, the whispers turned sharp. Her name became synonymous with exploitation. What she saw as loyalty to her family, the nobles saw as a slow dismantling of Hungary's autonomy. Her ambition had crossed a line from court politics to cultural warfare, and that's when resentment hardened into something else: resolve. A quiet agreement began to take shape among the native lords. If Hungary was to remain Hungarian, the queen would have to fall, not by debate, not by diplomacy, but by blade. The queen didn't scream, at least, not loudly enough to reach the edge of the forest. In the stillness of the Pilis woods, under a golden canopy of autumn leaves, Gertrude of Merania was cut to pieces by the very nobles who once bowed before her. But this was no ordinary assassination. It wasn't swift. It wasn't clean. It wasn't meant to silence her. It was meant to erase her. What happened on September 28, 1213, wasn't just the murder of a queen. It was a ritualistic humiliation, a theatrical execution designed to send a message so visceral it would stain the soil itself. The accounts vary, but they all agree on one thing: the killing was brutal, and it was personal. Swords were unsheathed not just to end her life, but to dismantle her body. Her limbs were said to be hacked from her torso, her flesh desecrated. And then, according to the legend whispered through centuries, the pieces were dumped in a remote clearing where a pack of wild pigs devoured what remained. Whether literal or symbolic, that detail holds devastating meaning. In the medieval Christian world, to be eaten by pigs was to be denied resurrection, to be spiritually damned, to become less than human. This wasn't vengeance. It was transformation. Gertrude was no longer a woman. They made her into a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when foreign queens overstep their place, when outsiders dare to rule as if they belong. Her death became an anti-coronation: no crown, no burial, no dignity, just torn flesh in a forest and silence that screamed louder than any battle cry. But the message didn't end there. The conspirators didn't just want her gone. They wanted her erased from memory and sanctity, denied the respect even enemies usually received in death. And yet, ironically, it was this act of cruelty that ensured she would never be forgotten. Her murder became legend, her dismemberment, myth, her mutilation, a national scar. Because in the end, the forest didn't just witness a queen's death. It witnessed a political exorcism, a purge of power, of gender, of identity. Gertrude died not for who she was, but for what she represented. And centuries later, we're still haunted by what they did to her body. Because deep down, we understand what they were really trying to destroy. When King Andrew II returned from his campaign and learned of his wife's brutal death, the kingdom held its breath. Everyone expected swift vengeance, royal fury, fire and iron. After all, this was not just a murder, it was regicide, the killing of a queen consort, a crime so grave it shattered not only law, but the divine order that medieval monarchies claimed to represent. And yet, something strange happened. Yes, a few conspirators were punished. Some were exiled, but most walked free. The very nobles who orchestrated Gertrude's murder, who dismembered her body and desecrated her legacy, escaped the full weight of the crown. That silence speaks louder than any royal decree. It suggests what no official chronicler dared write, that Andrew may not have wept for his wife, or at least not enough to risk war with his own nobility. Historians have long speculated that Andrew II, though outwardly outraged, may have secretly welcomed the end of Gertrude's reign. She had grown powerful, too powerful. She had ruled in his absence, handed out royal favors, and arguably outshone him at court. In a world where kings guarded their authority like sacred relics, a queen who governed boldly was not a partner, but a political liability. And so, Andrew's response felt half-hearted. It wasn't justice, it was containment. A gesture to appease foreign allies, to maintain appearances, but not enough to provoke the magnates who had clearly reached their breaking point. The palace did not become a courtroom. No great purge followed. Instead, the court returned to order as if nothing had happened, as if the forest had swallowed Gertrude not only in body, but in memory, but the damage had already been done. The queen's death and the tepid royal reaction ripped open Hungary's political seams. Trust between the monarchy and nobility fractured. Foreign alliances became suspect, and worse, a dangerous precedent had been set that even queens could be killed without consequence if they crossed too many lines, favored the wrong people, or wore power too visibly. Gertrude may have died in the forest, but her ghost haunted the throne. Because every monarch after Andrew would have to wonder how many swords are waiting behind the curtain, and how long before silence becomes betrayal. She may have died torn apart in a forest, but Gertrude of Merania did not stay buried. In fact, her afterlife proved far more powerful than her reign. Centuries after her mutilated body was laid to rest officially, at the Pilis Abbey, her memory was resurrected not in royal records, but on the stage. And when she returned, she was no longer just a queen. She was a villain, a tyrant, a foreign oppressor wrapped in silk and sin. In 1819, Hungarian playwright József Katona unveiled his tragic drama, Bank Ban, a fictionalized retelling of Gertrude's assassination that would ignite the cultural imagination of a nation struggling under foreign domination. In Katona's version, Gertrude, renamed Gertrudis, is not just politically ambitious, she's morally rotten. She turns a blind eye as her brother rapes a nobleman's wife, mocks the suffering of Hungarians, and rules with cold disregard for the people she was meant to serve. Her death at the hands of the tragic hero Bank is not seen as treason. It is redemption, a catharsis, a patriotic act. It didn't stop there. In 1861, composer Ferenc Erkel transformed the play into a national opera, also titled Bank Ban. It became a cornerstone of Hungarian cultural identity, performed in defiance of Habsburg rule, embraced by revolutionaries, and weaponized as a cry for sovereignty. Gertrude, in these performances, was no longer just a queen from the 1200s. She was a stand-in for every foreign ruler who had ever tried to silence Hungary's voice. But here's the twist. The version of Gertrude that lives in these works is almost entirely fictional. There is no historical record of her condoning rape. No proof that Bank, a real historical figure, murdered her. The emotional justification crafted in these stories served a deeper need to give moral clarity to political violence. In art, she became the symbol of the other, the elite outsider whose death brought justice to the people. And yet, the real tragedy may be this: Gertrude lost control of her story. Just as the nobles once stripped her of her body, history stripped her of nuance, turned her into myth, into metaphor, into an enemy people could cheer for killing. That's how nationalism works. It doesn't bury the dead. It rewrites them. History loves a villain, and when it can't find one, it invents her. The Gertrude of Merania that lives in Hungarian literature, the ruthless queen, the silent accomplice to rape, the foreign parasite feeding off a suffering people, is a masterclass in historical distortion. But if we peel back the theatrical layers of Bank Bon and the soaring choruses of Erkel's opera, we're left with a far more complicated truth. The Gertrude of fact bears little resemblance to the Gertrudis of fiction. There is no historical evidence that Gertrude ever condoned the rape of a noblewoman by her brother. There is no record of a personal vendetta between her and Bank, nor of a dramatic confrontation that ended in murder. These elements central to the nationalist myth were added after the fact, carefully crafted to give moral license to her assassination. Because political resentment alone isn't always enough to justify blood, people crave a villain with teeth, with cruelty, with sin. And so, art obliged. The rape subplot in Bank Bon, for instance, seems to appear out of nowhere in the historical timeline. It doesn't exist in any contemporary chronicles. It wasn't whispered in court, nor recorded in letters. Instead, it was imagined, invented to create an emotional firestorm, to transform Gertrude from a foreign queen into a moral monster. That detail reframed her death not as a political conspiracy, but as a righteous act of vengeance. But in doing so, it also erased her humanity. The danger of mythologizing history is not just in what it adds, it's in what it erases. Gertrude was undoubtedly ambitious. She favored her German kin. She disrupted the traditional power balance. But she was also a mother, a regent, a woman navigating a kingdom where her very presence was seen as a threat. Turning her into a symbol of tyranny flattened her into a one-dimensional caricature. And yet, this distortion worked. It survived because it gave the people something simple to believe in. Good versus evil. Patriot versus traitor. Hungarian versus foreigner. But real history is rarely so tidy. The truth about Gertrude is murky, political, human, and far more tragic. Because what killed her wasn't just resentment. It was the need for a story clean enough to justify the blade. Gertrude of Merania didn't just die in 1213, she became a wound that never fully closed. Her body may have been buried in the soil of Hungary, but her legacy was carved into something far more enduring, the fault line between two identities: Germanic ambition and Hungarian resistance. And long after the swords were sheathed and the blood dried in the peerless forest, her name continued to echo through centuries of conflict, not as a woman, but as a symbol of foreign power, ethnic division, and cultural defiance. To the Hungarian nobility of her time, Gertrude was more than just a queen. She was the face of imperial intrusion, a walking reminder that their kingdom had become vulnerable to outsiders politically, economically, and culturally. Her court was filled with German lords. Her family was granted power and land, her influence unchecked. And so, when she was murdered, it wasn't seen by her enemies as regicide. It was seen as exorcism, a violent cleansing of the foreign stain from Hungary's royal body. But symbols are slippery things. What began as a local act of rebellion evolved through literature, legend, and propaganda into a national narrative. In the centuries that followed, Gertrude was invoked again and again whenever Hungary found itself subjugated by foreign powers, from the Habsburg domination to the pressures of Austro-Hungarian compromise. Her story became a cultural shorthand, a mythic reminder of what happens when outsiders rule with arrogance and when native voices are pushed aside. This is what makes Gertrude's legacy so enduring and so dangerous, because she is not remembered as herself. She is remembered as a symbol, and symbols can be used to justify anything: revolution, revenge, or silence. Her assassination, once a desperate crime of political passion, became a template, a tale of justified violence in the face of foreign control. It was no longer about Gertrude the woman. It was about Gertrude the idea. In the end, she became the embodiment of a national fear that Hungary could be ruled but never truly understood by an outsider. Her life, her murder, her myth, they all became tools in a much bigger struggle, not just for power, but for cultural survival. And like all powerful symbols, she's never really gone. She still waits. In the pages of nationalist plays, in the shadows of ruined abbeys, and in every story where identity is drawn like a blade. What does it take to dehumanize a queen? Not just a sword, but a story. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part of Gertrude of Merania's legacy, not how she died, but how easily a human being became a symbol, a scapegoat, a cautionary tale. 8 centuries later, the forest where her body was allegedly left for pigs remains quiet. But in that silence lies a brutal truth. Power alone doesn't protect you from erasure. In fact, it often invites it. Gertrude's story is about more than a political murder. It's about how societies decide who gets to belong and who doesn't. She was a queen by marriage, a regent by necessity, a woman ruling in a man's world. But, to those around her, she was never truly one of them. She was foreign, ambitious, unrelenting, and that combination proved fatal. Once a figure is seen as other, it becomes alarmingly easy to strip them of complexity, dignity, even their right to exist. What began as political resentment transformed into a moral justification for violence. And the more she was hated, the more her humanity was rewritten, until her legacy was no longer her own. This pattern is not just medieval, it's timeless. We still live in a world where people are vilified for where they come from, what they look like, or how loudly they speak truth in rooms not built for them. Whether it's immigrants, women in power, or cultural outsiders, the impulse to destroy what we don't fully understand is very much alive. Gertrude's fate warns us when identity becomes threat. Empathy disappears. And when narratives are weaponized, truth is the first casualty. For a modern audience, especially in America, a nation built on both diversity and division, the story of Gertrude is a sobering mirror. It reminds us that power must be held with humility, that leadership requires cultural sensitivity, and that ambition without connection breeds isolation. But more than anything, it's a warning no one is safe when fear shapes the story. So the next time we're tempted to reduce someone to a stereotype, to cheer for their downfall because it's narratively convenient, we should remember the woman left in the forest, not as a queen, not as a villain, but as a person who was devoured, first by blades, and then by history. If this story made you think twice about how history treats power, identity, and truth, don't let it end here. Drop a comment with your thoughts on Queen Gertrude's legacy. Was she a tyrant, a victim, or something in between? Save this video so you can come back to the parts that hit hardest, and subscribe for more dark, powerful stories that peel back the layers of the past. Because the more we question history, the more we understand ourselves. Let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters just as much as the story.